Okay, good afternoon, 61C. We're almost there. One more lecture after this one. So today we're talking about something a bit different, one of the big ideas in computer architecture, and that's achieving dependability through redundancy. We'll talk about that and about RAID. So just to quickly recap last time, I think Saga told you about I/O, how I/O gives computers their senses. One of the problems with I/O, it's so slow relative to how fast electronics run. We have to deal with it in different ways. And instead of wasting the CPU looking for something to happen in the real world, you put little devices out there and they use DMA, direct memory access, to transfer the data in. And then only when there's enough work to do you interrupt the CPU and have it go look at the I/O. Also talked about the major I/O devices on computers, disks, which we use for persistent storage. After the power goes out, you want your data still to be there. And these days, flash has mostly replaced small disks, and it's sort of eating its way up through bigger and bigger drives. The networks, how everything talks to all the computers talk to each other over the internet, and that's another kind of I/O device. So that was last time. This time, we're going to look at one of these great ideas, redundancy. So the idea of making a system dependable by using redundancy. There's so many components in modern computers today that, it's highly unlikely that there won't be failures regularly. And so there has to be technology built in to handle this. Otherwise, the thing would just fall over. So here's a small example of you got three adders calculating 1 plus 1. And if you have three of them, you can take a vote. And so if one of them gets it wrong, 1 plus 1 is not equal to 1. You can take a vote, and if 2 out of 3 agree, you kind of pick that as the correct answer. So this is one simple example of using, this is called triple modular redundancy. Do it 3 times and vote. I guess the old space shuttle used to use 5 computers, and I think 4 out of the 5 had to agree on what to do next, else the launch was stalled. Now, we use this idea of redundancy many different levels and scales in a computer system. At the very biggest scale, companies like Google have many data centers. There's not just one Google building that has all the computers in. There's dozens of them spread around the globe, and they can actually shift capacity. If one of the data centers, whole data center goes down, they can move the operations to the other data centers around the globe. The internet itself was designed to be highly redundant. In fact, it was a Department of Defense project to provide a network that would survive nuclear attack. That was where the internet came from. And the idea was that messages try many different routes to get to the, if one route goes down, it can still reroute around it and be very resilient to disastrous things like that, or just hackers, I guess, these days. RAID, we'll talk about that at the end of today's lecture. So the idea of RAID is use a lot of disk drives, and disk drives are mechanical, rotating bits of machinery. They're kind of somewhat archaic in a computer system. You have this magnetic disk rotating around with a head flying over the surface of a disk. It's very easy for things to go wrong in such a device. And the idea of RAID is to use lots of disks in parallel with error-correcting code, and so if one of the disks dies, you can still keep going. We'll talk about how that's implemented later today. And also we'll talk about how you implement error-correcting codes in memory. The most numerous transistors in your computers are the transistors that make up the memory system in your computer. All the DRAM and flash in your system, lots and lots of transistors there, billions and billions of transistors. And it's, highly likely some of those will fail. And because those memory transistors, you make them very tiny, they're also very susceptible to cosmic rays. So, you're sitting here in this auditorium, you're being irradiated by cosmic rays the whole time, as is your laptop. If you're in an airplane, you get about 100 times as much radiation as you do at ground level. The atmosphere kind of absorbs some of it. But you'd like your computer to keep working, or if you're on a plane, you want your laptop or tablet to keep functioning. And so we have ECC in there to cope with these soft errors that occur, that when a cosmic ray hits a bit of your memory, it can flip the bit. Right? And this is something that will probably happen to you a few times a year. Right? Sometimes your machine will crash and you'll brain Windows or Mac OS, but it could just be a cosmic ray hitting you. Right? So let's do some terminology about dependability. So dependability is this overall umbrella term about how much can I rely on this system, and rely on it meaning it does what I want it to do as fast as I expect it to do, and I don't have to go do something else because it's broken. And so that's the goal of dependability. If you dive down in, the things you're worrying about are things called faults, which is a failure of a component, right? So some piece in the system may fail that may or may not cause the overall system to stop providing you service, right? However, if it does cause system failure, then you're going to get an interruption in service, right? So there's a notion of there's some level of service I expect from the system. It's a failure if I don't get that level of service. So if some fault causes a failure, we call that a system interruption, the service interruption. And after some time, once you figured out there was an interruption and you figured out what went wrong, you can repair the system and bring it back up, and that's restoration. Right? So there's this notion of there's some acceptable level of service from the thing, whatever that thing is, whether it's a whole data center or a disk drive in your computer. And if there's some fault that you haven't protected against that can cause failure, and after there's failure, there's repair, and then there's restoration. You go back to having service as usual. So that's some of the terminology we use in dependability. Now, redundancy can happen both in time and in space. So spatial redundancy is probably the easiest one to get your head around. It's just you have multiple copies of things, and you just check to see if something's failed, you have another copy somewhere else that you can use instead. So you've replicated in space. And this can handle both a hard failure or a soft failure. Now, a hard failure is something where it just broke. The thing's broken, it's never going to get fixed unless you replace that component. And then a soft error is something that just happens occasionally. And if you retry the operation, it's going to be okay. So the cosmic ray strike is an example. Ray hits your bit in your memory cell, it'll flip the bit. But if you write the bit again and then read it again, it's going to get back to being working. It was just a temporary problem. That's a soft error. Okay, so spatial redundancy can handle both hard and soft errors. But if you're just worrying about soft errors, another technique is just temporal redundancy, where you just try again later, right? I tried it once, didn't work, something went wrong. Let me try again, maybe it'll work again this time. Maybe it was just something transient in the system, okay? So there's two types of redundancy. When we're evaluating systems, we need some kind of measure of dependability. And these are some of the terms you'll hear. This is really just going through the terminology. So reliability is the mean time to a failure. And then there's also the mean time to repair, which is when something goes wrong, how long does it take to fix it and get back to being operational again, right? And that's the amount of time that you're interrupted, like you can't do stuff because it's being repaired, right? That's the MTTR as the acronym. And the mean time between failures is kind of the sum of these. So after some amount of time, the mean time between failures, then there's a time to repair. So there's mean time to a failure, then you repair the failure, and then it's ready to fail again after some point in time, right? So if you add together MTTF and MTTR, you get MTBF, the mean time between failures. Okay. Yep. Right, so the model here is a very simple model. It's either working or it's broken and you're repairing it. And when it's broken, your service is interrupted. And once it's repaired, you're restored and you're back to providing service again. Yep.
So then, is this for one part of your computer?
Yeah, so it's good. The question is, what's the scope? So I think that's part of the definition. Whatever you're talking about, you have some system providing a service, whether it's a whole data center or a disk. In that context, you'll set the context, and then you'll ask questions about, like, what's the mean time to failure of a disk, or what's the mean time to failure of a data center? And those will be different contexts that you're evaluating, right, different systems. So for any one of those, you first set the context, then you can ask these questions about that component. So availability is this measure, well, for what fraction of the time is the system providing me service? Okay, so that's just simply the mean time to failure divided by the sum of the time to failure and time to repair. So that's what fraction of the total time the system's running is it actually, can I rely on it being there? And so, there's basically two techniques to improve availability, and these are both important. One is make your system more reliable, use better hardware components to increase the time between failures, or add some kind of fault tolerance. So something may go down, but your system is still available to you, so it hasn't really failed from your perspective. And the second thing is improving the time to repair, so make it quicker to find what went wrong and bring the system back from when it went down. And both of these are very important to get high availability. So just to give you some idea of this mean time between failure, it's not like, you manufacture lots and lots of disk drives, you ship them out there, and it's not as if the mean time between failure is 2 years, that everything's fine on every drive until 2 years' time when they all just die. There's some distribution of when the disk drives die. I know sometimes it seems like they engineer things to fail exactly 1 week after the warranty expires, but that's not actually possible, right? It's all a statistical measure. So over time, what you'll see is over this population, the probability of failure will increase, and so you have some notion of, say, this point, like 20% of the drives will have failed at this point in time. But then it's pretty steep after that usually. There's usually a wear-out mechanism, a sort of systematic reason for failure in some systems. Right? So there's a probability that any given drive will fail, and the mean time to failure is just an average over the population of the kind of devices you have to work with. It doesn't say anything about your individual drive. You may be unlucky and take it home and it fails a week after you bought it. Right? But then you take it back to the manufacturer to get a new one. So measuring availability. Remember, availability is the fraction of time that your system, the service is up. And it's usually given as a percentage, or you usually measure the mean time between failures in hours. It's just a convenient unit for kind of systems we have. In the old days, computers would usually fail about every 2 or 3 days, especially the ones built on vacuum tubes. There'd be so many vacuum tubes, the likelihood of one breaking was enough that every few days something would be down and somebody go in and have to fix it. These days, systems are very, very reliable in comparison, but we still measure time between failures in the hours. But availability, because it's got so good recently, the shorthand we use is to say how many nines of availability do you have? And what that means is 1 9 is 90%, right? So if 90% of the time your system is available, we say that has 1 9 of availability. And what that corresponds to, if you look over a year, it would mean that 36 days out of the year your system is not available, right? You'd have to over a month of the year would be spent waiting around for the system to be repaired. Doesn't sound too good. If you go to 2 9s, that's 99%. That's a bit better, but now you're still waiting 3.6 days of the year, where the system's just not available to you. And going up, 3 9s, 99.9% of the time the system's available. Now you're down to 526 minutes, sort of less than 10 hours of downtime in a year. Right? Yep.
This may be like a little weird, but let's say like in your body, like how your cells they malfunction or whatever, then your body gets rid of them. Is there any way to let's say when you have like a disk or disk failure, to reduce like the kind of unit so you could just kind of could it fix itself, or do you
Well, the way the repairs usually happen in systems these days, there are some hot spares. So most systems you'll have, like the memory chips in your computer or the flash chips you have, they have some spare cells. And as cells wear out, they will swap in the hot spares without you having to do anything manually. But at some level, you have to, an operator has to go in and pull out the bad disk and put in a new disk to repair it. And the cool thing is about some of the systems is you can actually pull out components and plug them in while the system keeps running. And so an operator can actually fix it while it's live, and there's no downtime. And you'll need that if you want to get to the higher nines. So 4 9s is only 53 minutes of repair a year. So a 4 9 system is only down for an hour a year. 5 9s, you're only down for 5 minutes in each year. And what that basically means is you can't go down. And things like the telecom systems, they're spec'd up in this kind of range, 4 to 5 9s a year. They really have to be up all the time. And the only really way you can achieve that is if you can do online repair, actually have tolerance so the system remains available. It knows there are faults in there, but it instructs operators to come along and fix them while the system keeps running. For example, there are mainframes you can actually pull out memory modules that are broken while the system's running and plug in new memory modules, and it keeps running. There's even mainframes, when you buy a new one, like with your banks, the systems they run, they can't stop for a system upgrade. So what they do is they run a mainframe, they buy the second mainframe, both start running, they move the jobs over to the new mainframe, everything keeps running, and then they stop the old one, and they're running on the new one. So they don't even come down when they're upgrading their machines. It stays live during the whole time, during the whole process. So when you're hitting these high availabilities, that's the kind of systems you need to have, need to engineer. So another way of looking at reliability is annualized failure rate. How many things break in a year? So this is useful for looking at disks, for example. So when you're in these warehouse scale computers, you have many, many, many disk drives, thousands and thousands and thousands of disks. And what's interesting, as these data center operators, like Google, for example, have started publishing figures on what they see in memory errors and disk errors, and this is a lot more reliable than the vendors' quoted figures for their parts, because this is actually in production systems in use. And so we're starting to see some very useful data, interesting data coming out of these companies. So let's take a little example. Say at 1,000 disks, and they were rated with 100,000 hour mean time to failure. So on average, you can run a disk that long, and then it will break. But if you have 1,000 disks, you'll figure out, if you work through the numbers, you're going to get like 87 failed disks a year on average. Right? It's a big enough population that that's pretty much you can rely on that many disks breaking during the year. So what that tells you is if you're a big operator of these data centers, you better have highly redundant storage systems in place, because your disks are going to be breaking all the time. So while the system's running, things are breaking out from under you. And your users will be a bit upset if, you imagine this is quite a large part of the fraction of the population of disks. If every year they send out notices to people saying, sorry, we lost your Google Mail, disk crashed, sorry. That's not really an acceptable model for these guys. They have to keep your data alive and working, and what's more available and accessible, even though the drives are failing out from underneath them regularly and continually. So actually Google, this is old data now. What they saw is how the annual failure rate basically grew over time. So, the manufacturers might quote a number, but, the first year things are pretty good, only 1.7% in the first year, but it kind of rises to 8.6%. Basically, the drives wear out, and they start to break down over time. And so what you might actually do is proactively replace old disks, because you just assume, well, the older ones are going to break anyway. They're a lot smaller than new disks anyway. I'm just going to proactively go every few years, replace everything anyway. So looking at how you build dependable systems. So one thing is avoiding single points of failure. So it's all about redundancy. So you want to avoid having like the one thing that causes the whole. If that thing goes wrong, everything goes down. You want to have redundant copies of everything and be able to switch over to those to keep things going. Because otherwise you'll be, it's kind of like Amdahl's law but applied to dependability. If everything else is highly redundant and everything else, but you have a single power supply, for example, and the power supply breaks, it doesn't matter how much redundancy you have in the system, your whole service goes down, right? So it doesn't matter how dependable you make everything else if you haven't made everything very highly dependable. So it's limited by the part that you don't improve the dependability of. Okay, so let's go to general terminology and just give you the idea of dependability. Let's start diving into some of the technology people use to actually make systems as reliable as they are. And a big one is the idea of error detection and correction codes. So taking data and adding extra bits to it so that we can detect if the data was corrupted in some way. And this is useful both for memory, where you're storing data, or disks, where you're storing data, but also for communication, where you're transferring data around a system, where something may happen to it while it's being moved around down a communication link or a bus. Okay, so, but we'll look at it in the context of memory systems as these are one of the most common causes of errors in real systems these days. We talked about this a little bit. So these DRAMs, the dynamic RAMs that make up most of the main memory in your systems, like all these laptops, you have like 4 gig, 8 gig of DRAM in there. They're actually tiny, tiny cells, little capacitors that don't store a lot of charge, sort of 30, 40 femtofarads or something. They're not very much charge at all. And the problem happens is there are these cosmic rays that it's very hard to stop. They're very energetic. They just fly through the atmosphere. When they hit the semiconductor that makes up the memory chip, they leave behind, they hit it and they break apart the ionize, and the charge then goes and destroys that charge that's on that capacitor in your DRAM cell. So we can just flip that bit. So storing a 0, cosmic ray hits it, becomes a 1. And that's a soft error, because later on you can restore another, it hasn't damaged the cell, it's just discharged it or charged it. So now you can go use it again later, but it's just occasionally the stored value will be incorrect. And hard errors are when things actually permanently fail. One thing you might not realize is your silicon chips, they're solid state, there's no moving parts, but they do wear out. The way they wear out is you have voltages applied, currents flowing through wires, and actually that current is electrons shooting down the metal paths, and those electrons bump into the atoms, and they can actually move the wires around. And over time, those electric fields can cause the molecular structure to change in your chip. So, solid-state electronic chips do wear out when you use them. And so over time, you'll get these hard errors, where they get short circuits or open circuits being created on the chip. So both these things get worse, hard errors, soft errors. They both get worse as memories get denser and larger. They get denser so the individual cells are smaller. That means there's less charge there, so it's easier to disturb them. Also, there's just more memory, so there's more stuff to hit with a cosmic ray. You've got a bigger target to hit with your particle beam. So at least in high-end systems, a lot of laptops actually go without ECC. A lot of smartphones, tablets don't use any kind of error coding on the memory. And as a result, things just break. So occasionally your machine will crash. You'll blame Microsoft, you'll blame Apple. Actually, it was a particle strike that caused something to go wrong. Your software assumes that when it stores a value in memory and it reads it back, it gets the value it stored. But sometimes that assumption is wrong if you don't have ECC on the memory. And so, low-end systems aren't protected, and they do fail with ECC errors. If you care about the programs you're running, or if you're like a bank that has people's account balances, you want more assurance than that you didn't get a random error. It'd be a bit unfortunate if it didn't crash, but instead just added $1 million to somebody's bank account. They might be very happy, but the bank might be a bit upset to pay that out, right? So any kind of critical system, you're going to have ECC because these errors do occur in the memory system. And the way this works is you take the bits you have in the data word, say you have a 32-bit data word, you're going to use extra DRAM. This is redundancy, adding more bits to each word to help catch when there's errors in the word. So you're going to add extra bits, and those are used to detect and possibly correct any faults you see in that memory system. And the general approach taken with these error detection and correction codes is by adding more bits to a word, you've added more possible values you can store. So say a simple case, set a 4-bit data word. How many combinations of 4 bits are there? 16, right? So there's 16 different permutations of ones and zeros in a 4-bit word. If I add another 2 bits, how many combinations are there? 64, right? So I've quadrupled the number of possible combinations of ones and zeros, going from 4 bits to 6 bits. If you use 6 bits to store 4 bits of data, what you can do is say, well, of those 64 possible combinations, there's only 16 legal ones. All the other ones are illegal. And if you're clever in how you pick the 16 legal ones, if one of the bits goes wrong anyway, you can detect that, oh, that's an illegal code word. Something must have gone wrong. It's not one of the combinations that I selected to represent the 16 legal values. It's one of the other combinations. And if you're even clever with how you do the encoding, you could even determine what the original legal value was and correct it and go back. And that's the general idea of these error detecting codes. Add more bits so you have a lot more possible combinations. Mark some of those combinations as valid and legal. The rest you treat as illegal to help you detect the error. And if you have enough space, you can actually correct and come back to the original value. And this is much cheaper than doing a triple modular redundancy thing where you might think you have to have triple the data storage and vote on the whole field. This is a much cheaper way of doing this. So we'll go into how this works in the next few slides. So this general idea was, so Richard Hamming, who actually won a Turing Award for this and other work he did, he invented these concepts. One of the sort of building blocks here is the idea of a Hamming distance. It's named after Richard Hamming. So the Hamming distance is the difference in bits between 2 bit patterns. So I'll give you bit pattern A, bit pattern B, and look and see how many bit positions have different values in, right? So where they both 0 in the same bit position, that's a Hamming distance of 0. If the one has a 0, one has a 1, that's a Hamming distance of 1, and you just sum that up across all the bits in the word, right? So here you have This has 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. This has 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1. And the red positions are where the bits are different, right? So this is a 1, that's a 0. This is a 0, and that's a 1. So the Hamming distance between these two words is 2. That means there are 2 bit positions at which these things differ. Okay? It's a very simple concept, right? So what's it for these 2 words? Three, right? So this bit's different, and this bit's different, okay? So what we're going to be doing is adding these extra bits to create a code. So now imagine we have 2 data words, so many bits, and we add some extra bits for coding. And now what we're going to think about is if the minimum distance between, so we're going to pick members of the code, i.e. the legal values of those combinations. We'll pick those. And what if the minimum Hamming distance between legal words is 2? So we're going to make sure they're at least 2 apart. And you get a 1-bit error. First of all, if you have a word that has a 1-bit error in it, what do you know about that word? If you have a Hamming distance of 2 between all the legal words, and you get a 1-bit error on a legal word, what do you know about the resulting word with the error in? Okay. Yep. Right, so one thing is, the first thing is if you get a 1-bit error, that means one of the bits is different from a legal code word. So then you'll know that it's actually an illegal code word. The first thing is I get a 1-bit error, and I will know that because all my legal code words are at least 2 bits different from each other. Right? So if something is 1 bit different from a legal code word, it must be an illegal code word. So that's the first thing you know is it's illegal. Now the second thing is that because there's only a distance of 2 between any legal code words, you won't know which was the original legal code word, right? Because you can start from each end and corrupt 1 bit to get to this intermediate value, right? So you won't know. So you can detect one error, but you cannot correct that error, right? So let's just take a look at some very simple coding. So parity is a very simple way of detecting errors. And the idea of parity is in a single word, you count the number of 1s and 0s, and then you add an extra bit that makes the total number of the difference between 1s and 0s either odd or even, right? So even parity is when you want to have equal number of 0s and 1s, right? So if I count the number of bits and there's more 0s than 1s, you XOR them all together, then you add the extra bit in, and you want to make that bit cause the whole thing to have 0 as a total parity. So then when you read the word back, you're going to, what do you think about it? Just XOR all these bits together. So XOR them all together, and then if that result is a 1 or a 0, you're going to decide on what the new code bit should be to make the whole word have a parity of 0 or 1. Then when you read back these other bits, including the parity bit, you just check it to see if it matches the way you said it. And if you did, you know that there was no error there, right? So this is parity code is an example of something that has a minimum Hamming distance of 2, right? So every legal code word is different in 2 bit positions, because if you differ in 2 places, then your parity is the same, right? Okay. But you can only, in this case, you can only detect an error. You cannot correct. All you know is that it's 1 bit wrong from a legal code word, but you don't know which was the original legal code word, right? So you cannot correct it. Another problem is, and this is a general problem, that it only detects an odd number of errors. So you can if you get 1 bit in error, it will fall in the gap between 2 legal code words. You can detect that. If you get 3 errors, it will also fall in a gap, and you'll also detect that. But if you get 2, 4, 6 errors, it'll still be a legal code word. You just move to another legal code word, and you won't be able to detect that error, right? So it's limited, but this is a useful technique, and it's very commonly used. Just 1 extra bit on the whole word, right? So you can detect a single bit error. Let's do an example. So here's Data word 0101, 0101. 4 ones, so it's got even parity. So when you write this to memory, you can add a 0 here to keep the total even. Now, say you read the data back, and there's a corrupted bit here. Now you see, oh, I've got 5 ones. Right, that's now odd parity. Oh, sorry, if the data was this, then you'd have to add 1. Sorry, if the data had changed to this value, you'd have to add a 1 to make the parity even, all right? So it's an even number of ones in this case. If you read from memory and you get this back, you know this is correct. 4 ones, even parity, no error. If you read from memory, in this case, it's odd. Odd parity, you got 5 ones. So there is an error there, all right? So parity, just if you just XOR all the bits together, that gives you the, yep. So in this example, the question was, what if a cosmic ray hits the parity bit? Well, then you detect that as an error, right? So an error on the parity bit is also considered an error. You might say, well, that's bad because the data's okay. But, you know, part of the deal is you look at all the bits all at once. So what if error in the parity bit? Well, it's just an error. Okay. Okay, so the parity just tells you, okay, at least one bit, I at least got an odd number of bit errors. And that's, I can detect that. Now, detecting it is good. So if you're a bank, you'd want to know that something went wrong, and you would stop that transaction and go and restart the system. And then you could go do some kind of temporal redundancy scheme and, you know, try and replay it and, you know, correct it. But if you want to go at speed, you may want to not stop and instead correct the error on the fly, especially if, as with cosmic rays, things are relatively frequent. These things might be happening more common than that. And also, it may be expensive in general to be able to go, if something breaks, it may be hard to go reconstruct what you were doing and replay it. The banks are designed, their software is designed to allow you to do that. Other programs you write, you may not want to spend the time figuring out how to make them replay from some earlier point in the process. So it's useful to have techniques that will actually correct errors as they occur and just keep going. So the outer system that's using this in a component doesn't even know something went wrong, right? So, you know, Hamming came up with this scheme that gives you single error correction as well as double error detection. So you can correct a single bit error, but you can also detect if 2 bits were wrong, right? And he was actually motivated to do this because he worked on an old relay computer, mechanical computer, that kept having errors, basically. And he had to keep futzing with it and decided to come up with a better approach, and that was this coding scheme. This dates back to 1950. But it's still widely used code today. So here's the concept. This is a general concept. We've gone over this a few times. You have a sparse population of code words, legal things. So many fewer than the total number of combinations are legal. If you get an error, it's going to change the bit pattern away from a legal code to some illegal code, and that's what you can detect. And correction is if you can tell that the error didn't move you too far away from a legal code, or you're closer to one legal code than you are to any other. By closer, I mean in terms of Hamming distance. Then you know to go back to that legal code word as the most likely value, and that's your correction. All right, so you can just go fold back. So let's just work through an example. So this is showing you a 3-bit code, right? And just drawing this as a cube where each vertex is some combination of those 3 bits, right? There's 8 combinations of 3 bits. So to detect single-bit errors, if you just want to detect single-bit errors, you can have half of these combinations be valid data. So you can store 2 bits of data, 4 combinations. So you pick these 4 vertices, these 4 bit patterns as the legal data. The extra bit is now providing you a single-bit error detect. And basically, all the invalid codes space these guys apart. So 1 bit change will only take you to an invalid code in the space, right? So no matter where you start from a valid point, any 1 bit change will take you to an invalid combination, right? So that's just what we're talking about, 1 bit error detection. To get to correction, it's more expensive. You have to consume more of your possible combinations to provide this buffer between the legal combinations. In this case, with a 3-bit code, we can only encode 1 bit of data. And so we say these are the two, all zeros, all ones are the only legal combinations. Now if I get any single bit error will take me to one of these nodes, and those are at least 2 away from this code. So if I land on one of these, I know it's most likely a single bit error starting from that legal code word, so I can just correct back to that legal code word. Right? And similarly, up here, these 3 are closest to this guy. So this is probably the legal value, the correct value. But here, there's still, even though you only have 1 bit of error correct, you'll also detect if you had a 2-bit error, because a 2-bit error will basically take you from here over into here. So you still know you got an error. Yep. Right, so good question is, I get a 2-bit error, how do I know it was a 2-bit error versus 1-bit error? The answer is you don't. So you just know there was an error, you've detected there was an error, you think you can correct it, because you think it's, this could either be a 2-bit error from here or a 1-bit error from there, right? That's the problem. And you can't distinguish those. And so what generally happens in these systems that do correction, they'll keep logs of how many errors. Every time an error occurs, you'll interrupt the processor, record it in a log, and keep going. And over time, if something is failing a lot, you'll get suspicious and think, maybe this is erroring a lot. And the real goal is you design the system so it's highly unlikely you'll get a 2-bit error. And in the case of cosmic ray strikes, it's actually very unlikely that the lightning will strike twice. The same chip will get hit in 2 different places. And what actually happens when a ray strike hits the memory array, it disturbs a bunch of bits where it hits, not just a single bit, but multiple bits. But you arrange those bits to be in different words. So you kind of spread the bit errors around so they won't all clump up in one word that doesn't have enough protection. So sort of a combination of architecture and statistics make you hope that you won't get the double bit error case. Another thing that the big machines do is called scrubbing. So what they'll do is, the problem here is when I read that memory location, I'll find out there's some bit in error. But that bit strike might have happened an hour ago. I just got back around to reading that memory location. So the high-end systems actually are continually reading their whole memory system all the time, reading it and looking for errors. And if they see a single bit error, they'll scrub it and write back the clean, correct code word. And so if a second error occurs later, that will just be a single bit error, as opposed to letting the data sit there and accumulate errors over time. So they proactively remove errors as the programs are running. But you're right, there's no way of distinguishing a 1-bit and a 2-bit error. Okay, bit of a minute's trivia. So we're getting close to the end of the semester, and that means finals time. Our final is the very last final of the very last day of finals week. So 7 to 10 p.m., Friday, May 15th. So you have to tell Sagar of any conflicts by tomorrow, midnight. You're allowed 3 cheat sheets. You should think of this as your midterm 1 cheat sheet, midterm 2 cheat sheet, and your final cheat sheet. There will be review sessions. There's the days, times, locations there. Office hours going to run normal schedule during RRR week. And we'll give you more information about finals week a bit later on. Okay, so let's take a 2-minute break.
Can you explain why 1.8 code rebellion means?
Yeah, because we can only store. Okay, it's actually 1/3.
One third of the
Okay, let's get going again. All right, so the examples we've done so far, I just want to say there was a bug on this slide, so only 1/4 of the codes are valid, not 1/8. Right, those 2 are valid, the other 6 are not. So let's construct a more efficient error correction code, and this is kind of a cute trick, where we're going to take a large multi-bit word and add some extra parity bits, and what's the cute trick is the parity bits are actually point at which bit was in error, so you can easily correct the word. So the idea is to start off with a string of bits, and take all the bit positions that are powers of 2, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. We're going to start numbering the bits in this example from the left. Doesn't really matter, you can do it the other way around, but in these slides we're doing it from the left. And we're just going to use the other bit positions as data bits, right? So we're going to mix up parity bits and data bits together in a run of bits. And we're going to put the parity bits at every bit location that is a power of 2. So parity bit lives at bit 1, bit 2, bit 4, bit 8, bit 16. And in between, we put the data bits. And the idea here is each data bit is going to be covered by 2 or more of these parity bits. And every parity bit, where it is, each parity bit that we add is not going to cover the whole word, but only a subset of the bits. And which subset it covers, actually only half the bits, and which subset it covers depends on its position. So bit 1 is going to check all the odd bit positions, right? Bits with the least significant bit of the address equal to 1. Bit 2 is going to check bits 2, 3, 6, 7, 10, 11, 14, 15. Bits with second least significant bit of address equal to 1, right? So things with a low bit equal to 1, and these are things with a second bit equal to 1. Bit 4 is going to check things with a third least significant bit equal to 1. So 4 to 7, 12 to 15, 20 to 23. Right? So each parity bit is holding the parity over half of the data bits, but each parity bit is looking at a different half, and the way we're selecting which half is based on the address of the bit in the word. And finally, bit 8 is going to check bits that have the fourth least significant bit equal to 1. Right? So basically 1XXX, that's the bit pattern you're going to check for 8 to 15, 24 to 31, and so on. So looking at this graphically, so here's the bit positions from left to right. So we put a parity bit at location 1, 2, 4, and 8. We mix the data bits in between, so data 1, data 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So in this case, we have 11 data bits and 4 parity bits in a 15-bit word. And you can see this parity bit is calculating parity over this, every other bit position like this. This one is every 2, every 2, every 2, every 2. This one's every 4, and this one's the last 8. Okay, so by having multiple parity coverages of this word, okay, we started with this is the data, right? Then we fill in the parity by calculating the parity bits, relevant parity bits, and we fill that in. So let's just do this in this example, right? So the blanks are where we're going to put the parity bits. So position 1 is going to check these bits, which are bolded, right? And so what should the value of this be if we're doing even parity? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, so that's even already, so this can just be 0, right? Position 2 now is going to check bits 2, 3, 6, 7, 10, 11, the ones that are bolded, right? And what's the parity of these bits? There's 3, right? So there's 3 ones, so that's odd. You want to set it to even, so it should be a 1, right? This should be a 1. Position 4, you do parity over these fields, like these 4 and this guy. So what's the parity of that? It's just 1, right? So you just want another 1. And then position 8 here is just checking bits 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 at the end. Right, this is even, so this should just be a 0. Okay, so we filled that whole word in. Oops. Okay, so this is the whole coded word now. So that's the final result. And we've underlined the parity bits within that word. Now, so that's the data that you're encoding. You've added those extra bits of parity. Now, the cute thing is that when you get some data coming back, like this, this bit that's the parity bit, parity bit, parity bit. You get these parity bits here. And what do you know if the parity bit is a 1? What's happened? You don't know anything. You have to look across this collection of bits to determine what's the parity of all these guys, right? Including that parity bit itself, right? So what we're going to figure out here is that this parity bit here should have been a 0 because these bits, there's 5 1s here, right? So there must have been an error here. But we know at this position, this one's fine. So parity 1 is fine, parity 2 is an error, parity 3 is fine, parity 4 is an error. So because we know which of those parity 2 parities, some are correct and some are wrong, and if you look across those 4 bits, they give you the index of the bit that's incorrect, right? So now you know that bit 10, 8 plus 2, those are the two. Parity 8 was an error, parity 2 was an error, so bit 10 was where the error was. So by flipping that bit around, you'll have corrected the code word, right? So this is pretty cool. It's a pretty simple, elegant idea. The parity errors themselves tell you where the error was. And notice the number of parity bits you need to add is basically logarithmic in the size of the data, roughly, right? Because you just need enough bits to index any bit within the data word. But it has to also cover the parity bits themselves. So notice the parity bits are also protected in this scheme. Right, so this is just correcting it. So now I find this is where the error is. If I flip this bit, then I'll figure out that now, magically, all those parities will now be correct. Yep?
So now that you're, I guess, interleaving parity bits and data bits, can you store things in memory that have that can hold a certain number of bits? Does that mean that you're storing less data than you think, or what?
Yes, the question is now I'm using some of the bits to store parity bits. I have less storage for data. Right, and so in systems that have ECC, they add extra bits to each memory word to hold the parity bits. So if you buy a low-end, DIMM for your desktop PC that doesn't have ECC, it's usually 64 bits wide of data. If you buy an ECC DIMM, it's 72 bits wide of data. And that's one reason why the low-end systems don't use ECC. They're just being cheap, right? They just saves them the cost of the extra memory. But high-end systems will add that in. And this is the kind of scheme they'll use to do that correction across those 72 bits of data to extract 64 bits of correct. 72 bits of data plus ECC code. And then from that, you'll extract the 64 bits of data. Right. Yeah, just working through. I guess we just did all this. So, if you look through the overhead of this thing, if P's number of parity bits, D's number of data bits, this is how many bits you need total. You need the index space to be large enough to cover the data plus the parity. So if you want to do 64, you kind of need 7 bits, right? Because if it was just 64 bits of data, including parity, data and parity, you just need 6 bits. But you want 64 bits of data plus the parity bits. So you kind of need at least 7 bits extra. Yep.
When you're doing the store, instead of having the actual extra bit locations in memory, could you have it implicit? So if it maps to this set, those are the parity bits associated with that.
But you want to allow people to store any data value they want at any memory location they want, right? So you have this overhead in every location, right? But so it's just thing to notice that the overhead is just you need at least enough to cover the data word plus the parity bits. So you can think of it as log the number of bits I need for the data plus 1 to include the extra parity bits I need as well. And basically as the data word gets large, it's basically logarithmic in the number of data bits you have. So the overhead it's something, but it's not it's not huge to do this. Okay, so yeah, in 64 bits of data, you have 7 bits of parity. So usually in DRAM systems, they have a 64-bit data bus, and you get a 72-bit DIMM, so that's an extra 8 bits, which is one more than the bare minimum. And they actually use the extra coding to do something called chip kill, where they can tell if all the bits in one of the parts on the DIMM is broken. So this 64-bit bus on your memory is actually made of usually of 8-bit wide chips or 4 16-bit wide chips. And they use the extra coding space to tell if all of the bits in one of those has gone wrong. Right? It's called chip kill technology. Yeah, so this is called single error correction, double error detection. It's very common in memory systems. Yeah, we've kind of gone over all this. Right, and this is the standard thing in modern DRAM systems. Okay. There you go, it's just a big cube. You get the idea. Must have been fun drawing that. Okay, so this is okay for memory systems. Memory systems, you just grab one word at a time. And you actually just want that one word, and you want to make sure you get that data correctly. But sometimes you're communicating over a network or over a long serial link in design, like over a USB connection, or you're talking to a disk drive where you're reading a whole block of data from the disk. And then the errors are different in nature. So instead of just being a single bit in the middle of the word going wrong, you may actually get a whole string of corrupted bits in the middle of that burst. Like somebody stood on the cable as you were reading some data, or some breeze came by and disturbed the cable or something. So often you get a string of bits all getting corrupted at the same time. Another example is on CD, music CDs or CD-ROMs or DVD players. Their actual design spec was that you could drill a hole in it and it would still be able to read the data, right? So there'd be a certain size, I think quarter-inch hole. There'd be a certain run of ones or zeros that could be completely wrong, and you'd still be able to recover the data there. And the way they do that is by coding things in longer blocks. And so one way of thinking about this is, instead of having sort of parity on every bit in a word, I will take a chunk of data like this and calculate parity down the whole string of guys here. It turns out parity is not strong enough to really, so just calculating parity down the columns here. It's not really strong enough to find a lot of errors. And so people use stronger things, stronger codes. One example is this Reed-Solomon. This is the one that's used in the CDs, DVDs, magnetic disks. And basically have a block of data plus a chunk of attached error-correcting code. And it's sort of efficient as well. You take a very long block, because you access these systems in long blocks. And in general, error coding gets more efficient. The more bits you put under one code, the few extra bits per bit you need to do the error coding. So they tend to use these long blocks. In this case, say 223 bytes of data and 32 bytes of parity. And the kind of coding they do is, in this case, for a block of k bits, you transmit. One technique is to divide it by some number. Take the whole thing as a big, long integer number, divide it by some value, and see what the remainder is. And the only remainder equal to 0 is a valid code. Remainder equal to not 0 is an invalid code. And you can actually figure out what the correction value, which bit went wrong, to get the remainder back to being 0. Right? So that's the general idea in these one of these codes. This is say I had 14 data bits, 3 check bits, and some divisor. So I got this number I'm going to use. And what I'm going to do is long division all the way through all this bit string. At the end, I'll see what the remainder is. If the remainder isn't 0, there was some error in that long code. And I won't go through how you construct this, but this is the general idea. There's some code words are legal. A lot of the code words are not. In this case, they're legal if the remainder is 0 once you divide by this value. And doing this, you'll detect errors anywhere along this burst, or even long runs of errors. Okay, just a quick 61C in the news. So today was announced the ACM Doctoral Dissertation Award, which is worldwide what was considered the best thesis in computer science around the whole globe. And it was Matej Zaharia, and he won for his architecture for fast and general data processing in large clusters. And that's basically, his thesis was all about creating Spark, which is the system you're using to do Project 4. Anyway, so he's a Berkeley grad. He worked in the AMP lab. He's now a professor at MIT. But but he just won the ACM Doctoral Dissertation Award. So that's a very relevant, topical thing, given that you're going to be using his system in the Project 4. And also it's been taking, like a lot of companies using this. I just heard today that IBM has set up a 200-person technical group in the South Bay for Spark technology. One of many companies are using this stuff out in the real world. Also, there's usually a winner and then a couple of honorable mentions. One of the honorable mentions was also from Berkeley. John Ducci won it for some machine learning work he did also in the AMP Lab. So not bad. The AMP Lab got the award and one of the honorable mentions in the Doctoral Dissertation Awards. So well done, Matei. Okay, just to finish up, so we're going to be ending a little early because we have HKN coming in through the course survey. So the last bit of the lecture is going to be about disk drives and another Berkeley creation, which is RAID. So back in the old days, disk drives were kind of big rotating hunks of metal with magnetic material on them. So this is one of the first big disk drives, the IBM RAMAC, 1956. Thing was bigger than a washing machine, like looks like a big refrigerator, right? Over time, IBM, was very well known for disk drives, and so with their mainframe installations, they'd have these big cabinets, and this was kind of the state of the art in 1986. Each of these racks would hold one disk, right? And this would be your disk array, right? But when the personal computer industry took off, they figured out how to build these small Winchester hard drives, these small sealed containers. These early disk drives, you could actually open them up and take the disk out and store it and bring a new disk in. So the disks were actually manually replaceable. But for the personal computer industry, they invented these little sealed drives, and they were very small capacity to begin with. The first ones were like 5 megabyte of capacity on the disk, and that was huge at the time. 5 megabytes was a monstrous amount of storage, and 10 megabytes and 20 megabytes. And the Apple Mac was one of the first to have these SCSI directly attached on the PC. So if you look at the different form factors, the big high-end machines are something like 14-inch disks, 10-inch disks. These days are used to 3.5-inch are the big drives now and 2.5-inch are the small ones. But it used to be like 5.25 and 3.5. But these were the big mainframe designs. Now the guys at Berkeley were looking at this around that time, and they were sort of wondering about these IBM disk drives, which had a reputation of being very reliable, right, but extremely expensive, right? And they're just looking at how do you scale up storage for smaller systems. And, using these big single disks, 14-inch disks will give you more capacity, like in this case, 20 gigabytes in this massive IBM drive. But if you took a look at IBM also, they actually developed this Winchester technology. That was also an IBM invention, this small disk technology. And if you took these small IBM drives and said, what if I just took a lot of them and ganged them together, you would see that a lot of potential benefits, right? You get from, at the same capacity, you need 70 of these little drives to match one of these big drives, but you'd be 9 times smaller in volume. You'd be, 3 times better in power. You'd potentially be 8 times faster in bandwidth, and, 6 times faster in IOs, and a lot, potentially quite a bit cheaper. But the only big question mark was, okay, it replaces one big reliable drive with 70 mechanical rotating drives. And so the reason people hadn't done this was just they're worried about the thing failing, right? So you have lots and lots of little drives, the likelihood of one of them failing is pretty high. Remember the Google data, right? So there's this potential there to use a lot of commodity small drives, gang them together. But the problem was this redundancy, the thing's failing. Or how to cope with the failing by using redundancy. So this was a Berkeley project. The idea was born here of RAID, redundant arrays of inexpensive disks. That was the acronym. And the idea was to stripe files across multiple disks and add redundancy to get high data availability. So even if one disk failed, the thing will keep working. And if one of the disks failed, it's not good enough just to take that disk out because now you've lost your redundancy. What you have to be able to do is put a new clean disk in, reconstruct the data on that disk so you get back your redundancy, right? So when one disk dies, you'll have lost your protection. So you have to kind of quickly reinsert the right disk and rebuild it, right? So one thing the RAID folks did is come up with this taxonomy of different RAID levels. And RAID 0 was simple striping, where there was no redundancy, and you just kind of striped your data across all the disk drives. And that got you more capacity, got you more bandwidth, but there was no protection against failures. So if one of the disks died, you lost all the data that was on that disk. Right? RAID 1 was a very simple approach of just fully duplicating all the data on both disks. So you have every disk had a copy, complete copy. So every time you wrote to disk, you wrote to two places. So there was no improvement in write bandwidth, right? You're just writing it twice. But reads, you get twice as many places to read from. You got two replicas of the data, right? So you get more read bandwidth. The problem with this is it's quite a high overhead, right? You have to basically double the number of disk drives you have, right? So that seems, not that attractive, right? And at the time, I wouldn't have made it competitive with the IBM system, right? You need twice as much capacity. You actually ended up being more expensive than the IBM drive. So another idea is they just use a parity scheme instead of just simple replication. One thing I should say about RAID, disks will tell you if they failed. So they won't come back and give you data that's wrong, because internally on the disk drive, each disk is locally doing its own error control coding. So when it writes a block to disk, it's encoding ECC bits as well as the data. And so if you read a block and it's wrong, it'll tell you, I got that wrong. Or if the drive will fail, it won't respond at all, so you know it's broken. Right? So in this RAID 1 case, you'll know it's wrong and you know you have to go to the replica. Right? You don't have to encode that. Right? Going to this next level of adding parity, the idea is like the memory system, we're going to just add one disk, say for every 3 disks, and use this to store parity information. Right? So we take some logical data, we're going to write it here, but then store the parity here. So now the overhead is much lower. Right? It's just a fraction. I'm not doubling the capacity. It's just some, in this case, 1/3 extra disks I have to add. Right? The problem is every time I write, I'm going to have to calculate parity and write that as well. I mean, every time I read, I have to read back from all the disks and the parity disk to check if there's any errors now. Right? So that was RAID 3. And what happens if a disk fails? One of these breaks. You still have your data, assuming the other disks are correct. If only one of them's broken, you can reconstruct it by placing a new drive in there and storing to it the right value so your parity is correct, right? So you can reconstruct the failed disk just by, from the other disks that are still alive, you put that in and it rebuilds it by writing the correct value that will make the parity be, say, even across all the drives. Okay, so you can repair. So if this disk dies, you can plug in a new one and repair it. So RAID 4 is really just taking this out and looking at lots and lots of disks and doing this at high I/O rates. It's really kind of the same picture. We have 5 disks. And what you're going to do is write a block. Instead of a word at a time, you're going to write a block at a time. So a whole 4 kilobyte block. Yep. So all the disks, doesn't matter. If the parity disk fails, all you do is plug in a new one and you can recreate the parity you need. Your data's still there, right? You haven't lost the data. You can plug in a disk and it will recreate the parity from the other data. So this will only protect you against one disk failing. If 2 disks fail, if one disk fails, the other disks are okay, right? So like I said, disks will tell you they're broken. So a disk has enough smarts to know if I'm reading data and I'm getting the wrong ECC things, my data's broken. Or if it doesn't respond, it's dead. So it knows that it's broken. Yeah, the parity just lets you recreate the data. Right. So this is doing things a block at a time, and then you have these parity blocks. And the problem with RAID 4 is that if you look at doing reads and writes, when I do reads, I just read one block. Right? Instead of reading a bit from each disk, I'm just going to read a block from one disk. Then I read a block of parity information. Right? If I do 2 separate reads to 2 disks, I can read a block from this disk, a block from that disk. Instead of having to use all the disks on every block, I just go read from one of the disks and read from the parity disk. So you read a whole block from one disk instead of a block striped across all the disks. Right? That's the difference between RAID 3 and RAID 4. So here, let's go back. RAID 3, I'm reading one bit. Every time I read something, I read all the disks. Right? RAID 4 is a simple thing where I read a block from one disk and the parity from another disk. Right, and that gives you higher read bandwidth because multiple independent accesses go to different disks. You get higher bandwidth, except that everybody's hammering on the parity disk, right? Because everybody wants to read from the parity disk. When you do writes, you kind of, if you do a big write, you might write to all these guys and write to the parity stripe as well. So RAID 5, which is the commonly used one, kind of solves this problem by taking this bottleneck, the parity disk. Instead of having one disk be designated the parity disk, what you do is stripe the parity blocks across all the disks, right? So depending on which block you're accessing, you go to a different disk to get the parity block. And so now you've balanced the load of doing the reads and the writes across all the disks, and so you get higher throughput this way, right? So you just, based on which block you're accessing, you go to a different disk to find the parity block. Okay, so just instead of having one disk be the bottleneck, because every read and every write has to go there, you stripe the parity blocks across all the disks. And this is RAID 5, and this is a standard thing everybody uses. And the nice thing about this is, one disk fails, you pull it out, you can reconstruct it. Now, actually, what you'll also hear in the industry is RAID 6. And what RAID 6 is RAID 5 plus another disk for even more redundancy, because they find the problem with RAID 5 is that the system detects an error. It says, this disk is broken, replace this disk. The operator comes in and pulls out the wrong disk, is the usual problem. And then your data's hosed. So the reason I have RAID 6 is human error, right? So RAID 5 detects one disk failing. RAID 6 detects the dumb operator pulling out the wrong disk, right? And it's common enough that that's why they build RAID 6 systems, right? And these days, the systems even have like LEDs pointing at this is the drive to pull out, and the operator will still, for some reason, pull out the wrong one. So, okay. All right. So I think we're pretty much done. So this RAID was developed at Berkeley. It's, now it's become a whole industry, and the common way people build these systems everywhere. This is just some photos of the first RAID prototype that was done here in, I think this was in Evans Hall at the time. These are all the early prototypes that were built here at Berkeley, and now this is a major industry. Okay. So overall idea, redundancy gives you dependability. We talked about MTTF, MTBF, uptime, availability, error correcting codes, and RAID. So now let HKN go ahead and do the survey, and I'll see you on